Hello, everyone, and welcome to this GoGN webinar. We have a special guest speaker this time. I'm Rob Farrow. I'm one of the coordinators of the network. I first met Guy actually earlier this year at the Lillehammer Lifelong Learning Conference, which was in Norway, where he was a keynote speaker. And I thought that so much of what he was saying was relevant to open education and to the interest of GoGN researchers that I thought it was really essential to invite him to come and speak, and gladly he accepted. Guy is a distinguished economist, maybe best known for his work around universal basic income. I note there's another couple of trials in the UK this week starting up for universal basic income. Makes you wonder how many trials do we need before they just say actually it works, but that's maybe a conversation for another day. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Guy Standing. Thanks, Guy.
Thank you very much, Rob and Beck behind the scenes. And just to reflect on what you've just said, yes, there are new pilots. There are about 150 pilots, and I agree with you, Rob, that we have enough evidence. We should go forward, but that's for another day. What I'm going to do now is reflect on the current thinking about lifelong learning. It's being slightly romanticized as something that is beneficial for society, for individuals, and that we should all adapt to lifelong learning. I want to be slightly skeptical about what has been happening and reflect on the nature of the educational commons. I've been writing a series of books on the commons as a progressive agenda. The latest one is called The Blue Commons, looking at what's happened in the sea. And there's quite a lot in that about different forms of knowledge, which I will talk about shortly. Now, a commons is what belongs to all of us. It's a form of property and it's a form of activity in the sense that it's a public good. And a public good is something that if I have it, it doesn't deprive you of having it. Whereas if it's a private good, if I have it, it's likely that you won't be able to obtain it. And a public good is a superior public good because if everybody had good education, we would all benefit from having healthier links with one another and so on. So the education commons is something that goes back throughout history. And a commons is not the same thing as open access. It's not the same thing as free for all. It's something that requires government to be the steward, to preserve the commons, to preserve commoning. And it requires strong gatekeepers to hold the stewards to account. That's the nature of the commons ever since antiquity. And we think of it with Robin Hood, we think of it with going back to the Magna Carta and so on. So thinking of the education as a commons, the tragedy of the education commons in the last century or more is a tragedy of decommoning, in the sense that education has been transformed into a private good. And a private good with education means that actually it benefits some people to have more of it than others. And that creates a very competitive situation, threatening the quality of education. And as an economist, I have had to experience that we've seen what I call in my work, the neoliberalization of education, in the sense that during the 1970s, a concept that was spread and which is used now as if it's a sensible concept, human capital. And if you had more schooling, you had higher human capital and greater earnings power and so on. This concept is very problematical, and I'll come back to it later. But let me go back to ancient Greece. Now, ancient Greece had a very interesting set of concepts of time. very different from what we talk about in time today. They divided time into five types of use. There was labor, done by the slaves and the banosoi, the metics, the people who were outsiders. There was work, which was done around the home. There was recreation, and there was what's called shole or skole, which was a combination of public participation in the life of the polis, the life of society, and education. And a fifth one, which was emphasized by Aristotle, was urgia. Urgia, literally translated, is idleness. And they recognized that being idle actually was very important part of living. Modern dismissal of time spent idling is typically capitalistic in origin. To be idle is to be able to contemplate, to be able to reflect. And as Cato said, much later, he said, never is a man more active than when he's doing nothing. And this sense of urgia and schole blended with the key thing of Greek thinking about education with the term paideia. And paideia meant the search for truth. And the ancient Greeks recognized that the search was as important as finding the truth. The process of learning was an important process. And there was a very strong distinction, which was, we don't need to go into the details, but between Plato and Aristotle, between a tradition of authoritarian approach to learning, where the wise handed down to the masses that they could learn from the wise, and a dialogical approach associated with Socrates, which was that education is a dialogue, a constant learning and questioning. And Socrates famously said that he distrusted the written word because we needed to have an oral dialogue in case of misunderstanding by the person who is learning. And that tradition went with a distinction that has come right the way down into the 21st century, but is a very, very important distinction in thinking about educational development. Essentially, there are three types of knowledge. There's what's called situation knowledge, folk knowledge, as it's sometimes called. And this was associated with Socrates and the ancient Greeks, where they learned from traditions, from cultures, from learning over time. And this contrasted with what became much later known as scientific knowledge. Scientific knowledge is based supposedly on evidence, on a presumption that it embodies progress and improvement over time. And of course, scientific knowledge as it developed, particularly in social thinking, led in the 19th century to an artificial fragmentation into disciplines, economics, sociology, philosophy, psychology, all separate with their silo type approach, that certain questions are only applicable to certain disciplines. But this was not initially the case. Greatest of thinkers in the tradition of situational knowledge was also a great scientific contributor, and then that was Alexander von Humboldt in the early 19th century. And Humboldt was a polymath who understood the embeddedness of learning with appreciation of nature. And therefore, his whole thinking was a thinking oriented to reproduction, to preservation rather than accumulation and depletion of resources. Now, the third form of knowledge is technical knowledge, knowledge that is literally handed to you on a plate, how to do something, which way to do it, what is acceptable as best practice, and so on. And these three forms of knowledge, for a while in history, were roughly combined. And they were roughly combined best in the occupational guilds of the Middle Ages, epitomized by what developed in and around Florence, for example. And the guilds combined these different forms of knowledge and were essentially communities of social solidarity, where the reciprocities were also gendered and related to age. So the young who came into an occupational guild tended to bring definite improvements of scientific knowledge and technical knowledge. The middle-aged groups were the embodiments of the situation knowledge and were able to hold those up as principles. And the aged tend to be treated with respect because they had the wisdom of having seen developments in all three areas. Now, the dialectics of the occupational guilds meant that they also tended to be rent-seeking, communities within the state, a state within the state. And in the 19th century, as capitalism developed, the state went after the occupational guilds. Napoleon famously banned them in the countries occupied by France. And in the mid-19th century, in Britain, they were banned and in many respects and were outlawed. But they embodied a sense of integrated knowledge, and therefore they have played an important part. And as neoliberalism took over in the late 20th century, what happened is they not only disbanded the guild traditions, but turned it over to state regulation through occupational licensing, where, in a sense, the knowledge of particular professions or crafts were transferred to the state. And in an era, Thatcherism and so on, which talked about deregulation, in actual fact, was the period most dramatically increasing the regulations of knowledge in professions and crafts, state regulation. That's aside. What we've seen over the centuries is a gradual triumph of scientific knowledge, or what passes for scientific knowledge. And here I think it's important to realize that there's a dialectics going on in scientific knowledge as well. And there was a famous book by Thomas Kuhn written, The Theory of Scientific Revolutions, in which he said that a certain body of knowledge in a certain sphere, he used physics, but you can use it in any scientific discipline. At a certain point, a certain box of tools, a certain way of looking at things, a certain set of puzzles were accepted as a paradigm. And that paradigm became hegemonic in determining who could practice, what they could practice, how they could practice, and what was an acceptable set of issues to explore. Until suddenly a phase happened when the paradigm couldn't answer the questions people were asking. But that didn't necessarily mean the paradigm, the way of thinking, would be replaced unless there was in the wings, as it were, another paradigm, way of thinking, a way of posing questions, a way of educating that was ready to take its place. Now, in my own sphere of economics, we saw in the 1970s, when I was doing my PhD in Cambridge, we learned many issues and and ways of looking at things from the classic economists, from Keynes, from Ricardo, from Marx, and so on. And we had a box of tools and the way of looking at it and the questions we were asking. And then suddenly the collapse of all of that took place with the rise of Reagan and Thatcher and a neoliberal economics revolution. And as a consequence, a new framework of education and knowledge became hegemonic. And most of the people who had the tools that I was educated to hold, and there were many, many, many very fine people, were literally excommunicated from their knowledge community. They couldn't get published in the prominent journals because the prominent journals were overtaken by the new hegemonic thinkers. And if you didn't get published in the main journals, you couldn't get tenured position, etc. And you couldn't teach all of the tools outside the hegemonic model. So for the better part of 30 years, neoliberal economics dominated thinking. It dominated the media. It dominated political thinking and of political right and left until 2008, when it failed dismally, that whole framework, as many of us have been saying it would, but there wasn't a new paradigm ready to take its place. And therefore, we're living in an interregnum where new ways of thinking are clashing with old ways of thinking, and gradually a new paradigm is developing. Now, here is a classic case where you don't have linear progressive ways of thinking, linear development of progress, of improvement. You have lumpiness in education. Very important development. Now, the trouble is that not only has this model been hegemonic, but it's elbowed out situational knowledge, folk knowledge. As I found in the Blue Commons, this has had terrifying consequences for the sea, the seashore, for everything to do with the sea, which is a commons or has been a commons, because basically they've said science means efficiency and progress, and therefore we need to increase efficiency. And as a result, there's been disrespect for reproduction, preservation, conservation in a pursuit of efficiency, productivity, GDP growth, and so on. And the wisdom of situational knowledge, some people call two-eyed thinking, has been dismissed as old-fashioned, holding up progress, etc., with disastrous consequences that I won't go into now. So what has been happening to the educational commons since the beginning of the neoliberal revolution in the 1970s and 1980s? In terms of education and lifelong learning, I just want to emphasize a few things that have happened. First, in any decommoning process, the first thing that happens, as everybody who's studied history at all in Britain will know all too well, is a process of enclosure. Enclosure means the state gets control in order to privatize. That's happened under the Tudors, it happened under the Victorians, it's happened in many, many generations where land has been enclosed, and in the case of the sea has been enclosed and privatized. And enclosure in education was really pushed very hard by Margaret Thatcher and her Keith Joseph, her mentor, and the Jarrett Committee on Education, where they basically said the state must determine the curriculum taught in schools. And the curriculum should be quite narrow because it should be functional for preparing people for the job market, for careers and for learning to be a good worker. Well, you don't have to be a genius to understand that that is a very specific form of learning and schooling. We should remember the English word schooling is used in a double sense. Schooling as in learning and schooling as in taming a horse. We use that term and it's very appropriate. We don't have a way of distinguishing education for living, education for being a person, and education for being a job holder. And the balance has been very significantly lost towards the second. Now, what we've seen is, after enclosure, a systematic privatization of every level of schooling. Neoliberal private goods have displaced public goods, and people are being taught in schools and in universities to be self-entrepreneurs, to be human capital. And paradoxically, where this privatization of schooling has developed further than even in Britain is in Sweden, where secondary schooling has been all privatized and is run by corporates which are teaching standardized courses using all sorts of modern technologies, but it's also taking place all over the world. And what privatization has done, and we're not just talking about the standard way of looking at it in Britain between public schools and state schools, we're seeing a privatization of the process. And it's led to a competition between institutions, a competition between schools, between academies, between universities, between colleges, all spending a lot of money and time trying to do the second aspect, or the third after enclosure and privatization, which is a commodification of education. And in the process, every aspect of teaching and learning has been transformed into a commodity. For the universities and schools, students are commodities, but being attracted to or kept in the institution, subsidized, whatever it might be. And this corporate commodification of schooling has led to a situation where everything, teaching aids to student accommodation to diplomas, is subject to some form of marketization, commercialization. And as a consequence of this, not only universities, but schools have been spending an increasing proportion of the total resources at their disposal in selling themselves. And this has led to a competition, and where the resources for teaching have been a declining percentage of the total resources available, because the objective has been to maximize revenue, maximize profits, and maximize brand, the selling of a brand. And this, of course, has gone together with something very sinister, which is developing in Britain as well as in other countries, but most of all in the United States. It's where the plutocracy have been taking over the commodification of education and creating private universities and colleges and so on, oriented to a political perspective, far-right populist perspective. And the classic biggest case of all is in the United States, called Liberty University, which is run by Jerry Falwell's son, an evangelical far-right populist supporter of Trump. And they have a department of over 350 people of student recruiters. This is real selling. And of course, this commodification has gone on furthest with the development of MOOCs, massive online open courses. And we've seen this in all over the world. The founder of the biggest, Udacity, famously predicted in 2010 that within 50 years, only 10 universities would remain and everything would be dominated by MOOCs. He's looking a bit foolish at the moment, but you can see the trend. The third trend, fourth, beg your pardon, it's enclosure, privatization, commodification, is financialization. And financialization is where private equity, the asset strippers, have decided that the education industry, as it's become, is the biggest in Britain, in the United States, and they have a market value that they estimate at $4.5 trillion, and they want some of the pie. So private finance is going in with buying up school chains, buying up universities, buying up brand names, buying up the process, MOOCs as well, and are becoming enormously powerful. The biggest landlord in Britain, owning most of the student accommodation today, is Blackstone, the American private equity company, and it's the biggest student accommodation landlord in most countries now, across the world. It's an extraordinary development. Now, these have gone with one other thing, a neo-colonialization of education. The frightening phenomenon in which globalization of school chains and university chains have been growing. So, for example, Harrow has schools in Bangkok, Beijing, Shanghai, and Hong Kong. Over 1/3 of all students at UK universities are actually students living and studying outside Britain. This is a tremendous change, and the United States is developing it even more with huge universities. And we're also seeing business-private partnerships. A famous case or infamous case was when Lehman Brothers was allowed by New Labour to have a partnership with a big secondary school in London. And they were allowed to effectively run the school board until they went spectacularly bankrupt from corrupt practices. But now that school is run by a Japanese bank. Now, this is a development that is dangerous as far as education are concerned. And the most important global neo-colonializing school system is Bridge International Academies, an American corporate which has a plan that by the end of this decade will have over 1 million students studying all over the world. They want to be what they say is the Uber of education, partially funded by the World Bank, by UK and American aid agencies, and they're spreading a particular gospel of American education around the world. You may like that, you may not, but it's certainly a phenomenon. Now, what I want to concentrate now is on the dangers of this transformation of a commons into a private industry. And there are 11 dangers that I want to highlight. The first is that the thought that schooling can be an answer to inequality is a fool's paradise. This was said by executives at Davos recently. They said, well, more schooling will reduce inequalities. No, it won't. Schooling has been a great instrument for increasing inequalities. It benefits the high achievers. It bypasses the group I call the precariat. And something like 80% of all those studying on the leading MOOCs actually have a university degree. So it increases their advantage. Whereas cramming has become a global disease. Not even the Chinese president has condemned it because it's causing so much stress, so much fear of failure, and so on. The second danger is what I call schooling consumerism. More and more people are being induced and encouraged to buy what I call stackable credentials. You know, you buy a certain course or another in the hope that it's going to benefit Then you're told, no, that's obsolescent, you have to buy another. Constantly buying new tools, new packets that soon become obsolescent. And the trouble is that people are encouraged to think this way because there's a claim repeated ad infinitum, that we suffer from a skills shortage. I've worked in the International Labour Organization and the United Nations for many years, and I've never been to a country where the business community isn't complaining about a skills shortage. And yet real wages have been falling. If there was a real skills shortage, their wages would be rising, one would have thought, okay? Similarly, employers have been slashing the amount of money they spend on training courses to a tiny level, despite government having given them more and more subsidies. The third danger, I think, is pernicious, which is that training for jobs, the job you've got today or tomorrow or now, is displacing a sense of career and vocational training and vocational education in a broader sense. That old idea of paideia, the old idea of a liberating education is being pushed out. The fourth danger is what I call the danger of time squeeze. We're being told that, and I quote in my work a number of people saying this, that we should be spending 15% of all our time every year on retraining. And if we don't, we'll become obsolescent, and therefore we will deserve whatever happens. This leads to people feeling that their time is squeezed. They're under pressure all the time, and they go into debt in order to try to counteract that happening. The fifth danger is something that is not talked about enough, in my view, and I would say a danger of learning unwanted clutter. We can have learning things that we don't want, we don't need, we do it because we're told we should have it. But of course, that always has an opportunity cost, that always displaces other things that we might be doing with our time. And it reduces, if you're having to do courses that are prescribed for you, you are also crowding out the space for informal learning, the situation knowledge, the other forms of knowledge that are actually essential for a balanced life. The sixth danger is a danger that the ancient Greeks would certainly have appreciated, and that's the danger of the authoritarian approach completely displacing the dialogical approach. You learn, you are taught, you have credentials. This is what knowledge is. But in actual fact, knowledge and questioning is a process. We're constantly struggling with answers and questions that we formulate and that we learn how to ask. And if you're constantly being subject to courses and being told, this is what you have to do, this is what you need, this is what credential, it crowds out that sense of dialogical learning. The seventh danger is a danger of corporatized mental capture. It goes with the previous point, but we don't have many courses or learning how to live, how to withstand the advertising that bombards us, the ability to manage our lives in a balanced and ecological way. That doesn't get emphasized by corporates or by government. Government says you must do more learning for jobs, for jobs, for jobs. But it doesn't emphasize these things. And this is taken to extremes in the fact that all the professions now have to go on regular modular courses every year or every 2 years or maybe a bit more. And they go on these courses And nobody, as far as I can find out, has actually proven that going on those courses actually improves performance or improves capacity to adjust and develop. Some of the courses are frankly disingenuous in complete satirical ways. Doctors often talk that they are sent on courses that are infomercials, really. I like the concept of auditors being sent on courses, including the following. The course is called Triangulation of Taxonomies and Ontologies Towards a Holistic Approach, 8 hours. And you have to pass it. Now, I think you probably need more than 8 hours to work out what the title of the course means if you're an ordinary human being. I don't want to repeat it, but you get my point. Many of the courses are there to indoctrinate and create a capacity to be a member of a particular profession with the disciplines and respect for authority. The 8th danger is a danger that is separate but goes with the others: excessive standardization. If you're actually being taught something and those are today's up-to-date skills, you can stop people developing their capacity for innovative thinking and practice within their occupations. The tendency is that many courses are over-oriented to today's perceived needs and not for one's own needs over a lifetime. Now, this goes together with something that I regard as truly scandalous and that I want to throw out just in case some of you are listening: the development of so-called education brokers selling apprenticeships. And the biggest one in Britain today is Multiverse, a company set up by Ewan Blair, Tony Blair's eldest son. And he became a billionaire, setting up this selling of apprenticeships. And now he's been allowed by the government to sell apprenticeship degrees, an oxymoron as far as I'm concerned. And he's become a billionaire because venture capital has piled in money, even though he claims his company for the 6 years of existence has been making a loss. And this is a real commodification of apprenticeships. Now, the 9th danger is a danger of false assessments, which I think is very strong. The MOOCs that are vast MOOCs, they don't have enough people to judge and assess the thousands and hundreds of thousands, millions of people doing their courses. So they tend to downgrade them by giving them out to unqualified people to do the assessment. This is a reality of the modern trend. A 10th danger is what I call nano-credentialism. Creation of mini modules of employable skill, breaking it down so you convert everybody into semi-skilled people who don't have a command of their whole subject or area of thinking or area of expertise. And the final danger is the most serious of all, and that's the danger of cultivating neo-fascist populism. If you reduce education to technical knowledge, functional knowledge, you automatically marginalize the teaching of ethics, the teaching of empathy, the teaching of culture, the teaching of history, the teaching of the arts that give you a capacity to reflect on the life of society. And you tend, therefore, to diseducate people and create a superficiality of understanding of political processes in the broadest sense, so that they listen to the purveyors of commodified truth so-called truth, purveyed by the likes of Trump and Boris Johnson and people who habitually lie, and they know they lie, but because people don't have the intrinsic knowledge to question, they are reduced to being consumers of what is put before them. Now, for me, I've laid out the crisis as I see it today. I think we need a strategy to rescue the commons, separate education from schooling and training, recover the soul of education, and develop strategies to give people more control of their learning. It's one of the reasons I've supported basic income. All of our pilots around the world have shown that when people have a basic income, they spend more time working and learning themselves. That is important, gaining control of their time. But we also need institutional changes where we recover the ethos of education as a commons. And I think we can do it, but we must be aware of the incredible existential threat of turning education into an industry. Thank you very much for listening.